Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about grocery shopping before supermarkets and why buying food for the week used to be slower, more personal, and honestly, a little more awkward than pushing a cart under fluorescent lights. Because modern grocery shopping can still be strangely exhausting. You can forget your list. You can stand in front of 12 kinds of mustard and feel your mind quietly leave your body. You can choose the wrong checkout line and spend several minutes studying someone else's coupons with the solemn patience of a person who has accepted their fate. But for most of us, even a frustrating grocery trip is still one trip, one building, one cart. One place where bread, milk, onions, soap, meat, cereal, coffee, apples, toothpaste, and frozen peas all sit beneath the same bright ceiling, arranged as if the world has agreed to become convenient. Before the supermarket became ordinary, food shopping often meant something much slower. It meant streets. It meant baskets. It meant weather. It meant a grocer who knew your family, a butcher who knew which cuts you could afford, a baker who might be sold out by the time you arrived, and a milkman whose bottles quietly appeared on the doorstep while the house was still half asleep. So get comfortable if you can. Let your shoulders loosen a little. Let the room become dimmer, and let the present day move a few steps away. Tonight we will drift through old market streets and small corner shops, past flour sacks and hanging scales, past handwritten ledgers, damp baskets, folded lists, milk bottles, paper parcels, and the quiet household arithmetic of feeding a family before everything was packed into bright aisles. And if you end up enjoying this sort of soft, strange history, you can subscribe if you want to, but only if it feels useful to have another calm place to come back to at night. The first thing to understand is that grocery shopping was not always a single event. It was a route. It was a little map drawn through the neighborhood by habit, budget, season, trust, and need. You might go to the baker for bread, the butcher for meat, the greengrocer for vegetables, the dairyman for milk, the fishmonger if you lived close enough to fish, and the general grocer for dry goods like flour, sugar, tea, coffee, rice, raisins, oatmeal, soap, candles, starch, and whatever else could be scooped, weighed, wrapped, or written down. The household did not simply shop. The household maintained a food system. And very often, the person maintaining it was a woman standing at the center of the home, carrying a list in her head before the list ever reached paper. She knew how much flour was left in the bin. She knew whether the potatoes in the cellar were beginning to soften. She knew which child would refuse cabbage unless it was hidden under gravy, which shopkeeper gave fair measure, which neighbor had mentioned cheap apples, and whether there was enough money to buy meat today, or whether soup would have to become more imaginative. There is a quiet pressure in that kind of knowing. Not the dramatic pressure of history books, but the low, steady pressure of breakfast arriving every morning whether the household is ready or not. Food is a very patient demand. It waits in cupboards. It waits in stomachs. It waits in the question that appears every afternoon, usually too early and yet somehow already late. What are we going to eat? Before supermarkets, answering that question often began outside. Imagine stepping into a town street in the early morning, with the air still cool and a little damp, and the pavements dark from overnight rain. The market is not yet fully awake, but it is already making its small sounds. Wooden crates scrape across stone. Canvas awnings lift and sag. A horse shifts beside a cart. Someone tips potatoes into a bin with a soft, earthy thud, while cabbages sit in green heaps and carrots lie with soil still caught in their thin roots. The market is not the clean, sealed world of later supermarkets. It is open to the weather. It smells of straw, mud, onions, apples, fish, horse leather, damp wool, wet wood, and human breath in the cold. Food is not hidden behind packaging. It is right there, bruised and fragrant and imperfect, with leaves curling at the edges and fruit showing the small dents of travel. There is something beautiful about it, and also something tiring. Because every purchase asks for attention. You do not simply pick up a plastic bag of apples and trust the label. You look, you touch, you ask the price, You wonder if the pears will ripen before they rot. You notice whether the onions are firm, whether the potatoes are sprouting, whether the greens will last until tomorrow, and whether the stallholder has placed the best produce on top in a way that is ancient, practical, and not exactly innocent. Bargaining was not always theatrical. Sometimes it was just a small negotiation, a raised eyebrow, a familiar pause, a quiet question about whether that was really the best price today. For a household on a tight budget, a few coins mattered, and there could be an emotional weight to asking. To bargain too sharply might make you seem difficult. To accept too quickly might mean you were foolish. To be known as poor could bring sympathy, but also attention. And attention is not always kind, even when no one means to be cruel. So the market was social as much as practical. People saw what you bought. They saw what you did not buy. They saw whether your basket held a roast, or bones for broth, or only potatoes and onions and a small paper parcel that could be stretched into soup. This is one of the strange things about older shopping. It was personal because it was human, and it was uncomfortable because it was human. In the supermarket, you can be almost anonymous, drifting past shelves with your private choices half hidden inside a cart. In the old market, your choices had voices around them, the stall-holder calling out, the neighbor passing by, the woman behind you waiting with her own basket and her own calculations, the butcher later noticing that you have asked for a smaller piece than last week. None of this had to be unkind. It was simply a world with fewer buffers. Food shopping happened in public, with money and appetite and class and reputation all folded into the same damp morning. From the market, you might move toward the corner grocer. The grocer's shop was a different kind of room. Dimmer, drier, more enclosed. The bell over the door might give a small tired ring as you entered, and inside there would be shelves crowded with tins, jars, boxes, packets, bottles, paper labels, tea canisters, tobacco tins, soap flakes, candles, and household goods stacked up toward a ceiling darkened by time. There might be sacks on the floor. Flour, oatmeal, rice, beans, sugar. Things that did not arrive in neat family-sized packages, but waited to be measured out with scoops and scales. The air would hold a mingled smell that is hard to find now. Tea dust, coffee, brown paper, soap, spices, kerosene perhaps, a little mustiness from wooden shelves, and the faint, dry sweetness of raisins or biscuits kept in tins. The grocer stood behind the counter, and the counter mattered. It created a small ceremony. You asked. He measured. He wrapped. He wrote. You did not always serve yourself. You did not silently take exactly what you wanted and keep moving. The shopkeeper had to be involved, which meant shopping was partly conversation, partly transaction, and partly performance. If you needed a pound of sugar, he weighed it. If you needed tea, he scooped it. If you needed flour, it came from a sack and rose faintly in the air like pale dust. Then everything might be wrapped in paper, tied with string, placed carefully in a basket, or sent later by a delivery boy who knew the route from shop to doorstep. The ledger sat somewhere nearby. That quiet book may be one of the most important objects in the old grocery world. It held names, dates, amounts, settled accounts, and unsettled ones. It could be helpful because credit allowed families to buy food before wages arrived, or to carry a balance through a difficult week. It could also be quietly humiliating. A ledger remembers what a wallet cannot manage. It turns hunger into handwriting. There is no need to make it dramatic. Just imagine the grocer opening the book, licking the end of a pencil, and adding a few lines under a family name while the customer stands there with a basket and a face arranged into calmness. The amount might be small, the feeling might not be. Credit was ordinary in many places, and trust could be a form of kindness. But trust could also become surveillance. The shopkeeper knew who paid promptly. He knew who was behind. He knew who bought tea when perhaps they should have bought flour, who asked for better goods when the account was already long, and who sent a child in with a note because asking in person was too embarrassing that morning. These old shops were intimate in the most practical way. They knew your appetite by account. They knew your household by weight. And while that could create community, it could also make the simple act of buying coffee feel like standing inside a very small public record. Beyond the grocer, the food route continued. The butcher's shop had its own atmosphere, colder and sharper and more direct. There might be sawdust on the floor to catch dampness, white tiles on the wall, hooks, blocks, knives, scales, a counter warmed smooth by elbows, and a man in a white apron who knew which families bought steak, which bought chops, which bought liver, which bought soup bones, and which asked how far a cheaper cut could go if cooked slowly enough. Modern meat often arrives already separated from the animal it came from, sealed under plastic, made quiet by refrigeration and distance. In the older butcher shop, meat was harder to ignore. It hung. It darkened. It had fat and bone and tendon and smell. The butcher's knowledge mattered because a household did not simply buy meat. It bought possibilities. A joint for Sunday might become cold slices on Monday, hash on Tuesday, broth by Wednesday, and a very small triumph of thrift by Thursday if the cook was careful. Bones mattered. Fat mattered. Dripping could be saved. Scraps could season a pot. The cheaper cuts demanded time, and time demanded planning, and planning demanded someone in the household thinking ahead while also thinking about laundry, children, fuel, weather, visitors, and whether the bread would last. The butcher might offer advice. He might also offer judgment without meaning to. There is a special discomfort in discussing money over meat. You are not only choosing food, you are revealing how much fullness you can afford. And still, the shop could be friendly. There could be greetings, jokes, routine, the comfort of being recognized, the small kindness of an extra bone placed in the parcel, or a suggestion for a cheaper stew that would not feel too much like surrender. History is often like that, not one feeling, several feelings standing in the same room. Warmth and embarrassment, pride and fatigue, community and pressure. The baker's shop was gentler, at least at first. It had the smell of warmth. Bread in the window, flour on sleeves, trays sliding in and out, loaves cooling under cloth, and the soft crackle of crust as fresh bread met cooler air. Before packaged sliced bread became common in many places, bread was more obviously a daily or near-daily food. It could go stale. It could be refreshed. It could be toasted, soaked, thickened into puddings, used for crumbs, stretched into meals, or treated almost like a small clock on the kitchen shelf. Fresh bread meant today. Stale bread meant tomorrow had already begun using yesterday. There were households where bread was delivered, and households where someone went out for it, and households where children were sent with coins and instructions not to dawdle. The errand itself became part of childhood. A small hand around money, a basket knocking lightly against a knee, the smell of the bakery door opening, the responsibility of bringing home something warm and not nibbling the edge, which is a level of moral discipline few adults should judge too harshly. Then there was milk. Milk before the supermarket often belonged to the doorstep. Early in the morning, before the household had fully entered the day, glass bottles might arrive with cream gathered at the top, their caps beaded with moisture, their sides cold against the air. The milkman was part of a whole quiet economy of routine. Standing orders. Returned bottles, notes left in windows or wedged under a bottle, extra cream for a holiday, less milk when money was tight. No delivery today because the family was away or because someone had remembered in time to leave the message. The bottles themselves were household objects with a little life cycle. They arrived full. They were opened. They waited on the table. They were rinsed. They returned empty. There is something soothing about that cycle, and also something revealing. Because the doorstep was not entirely private, the number of bottles outside a door could say something. The absence of bottles could say something. The quality of a household's food arrangements often sat in public, quietly visible to anyone passing by at the right hour. Delivery boys moved through this world too, carrying parcels from grocers, butchers, bakers, and markets. Sometimes on bicycles, sometimes with handcarts. Sometimes on foot, with brown paper packages stacked in a basket and a pencil behind one ear, moving through alleys and side streets while the city or town slowly warmed around them. For the household, delivery could be convenience. For the shop, it was service. For the boy, it was labor, weather, stairs, doors, dogs, impatient customers, and the delicate art of not dropping eggs. This is worth remembering. Convenience rarely disappears work. It usually moves it into someone else's hands. Before the supermarket, many hands touched the household's food. The farmer, the market porter, the stallholder, the grocer, the butcher, the baker, the milkman, the delivery boy, the woman at home unpacking, counting, slicing, saving, stretching, and turning separate purchases into meals that looked simpler than they were. By the time food reached the table, it had already passed through a long chain of ordinary human effort. And then, because food is very inconsiderate in this way, it had to be eaten before it spoiled. This may be one of the biggest differences between older shopping and modern supermarket life. The older household had fewer ways to pretend freshness would wait. Refrigerators, where available, changed daily life. Iceboxes helped before that. Cool pantries, cellars, larders, shaded shelves, stone floors, and careful storage all mattered. But still, food had limits. Milk soured. Bread hardened. Fruit bruised. Greens wilted. Meat required attention. Butter softened. Potatoes sprouted. Onions announced themselves. There was no endless chilled aisle quietly extending the life of every decision. The household had to think in terms of time. What must be eaten today? What can wait until tomorrow? What can be salted, pickled, dried, potted, preserved, baked into something else, fed to someone less picky, or hidden in soup with enough onions to make it seem intentional? This created a different relationship with food. Less casual, perhaps. More watchful. The pantry was not a passive storage space. It was a small room of obligations. Jars, tins, sacks, crocks, bottles, wrapped parcels, hanging onions, potatoes in a bin, apples in a crate, and a shelf of things bought carefully because money had a way of leaving faster than food arrived. To open the pantry door was to see the future in small quantities, enough flour for bread, enough tea for the week, enough sugar if no one was careless, enough oats if breakfast stayed plain. Enough potatoes probably, unless someone came to dinner. There is a very specific household mathematics here. It is not the neat mathematics of school books. It is softer, more anxious, and more practical. It counts appetites. It counts coins. It counts guests. It counts cold weather because cold weather makes people hungry. It counts growing children who have the inconvenient habit of becoming larger without asking the budget first. It counts holidays, illnesses, late wages, broken jars, spoiled milk, surprise visitors, and the private wish to put something nicer on the table even when nicer is not sensible. The handwritten grocery list was only the visible part of this arithmetic. It might be written on the back of an envelope, on a scrap of paper, on a slate, or kept partly in memory because paper itself was not always something to waste. Flour, tea, soap, candles, oatmeal, lard, apples if cheap, bones for broth, coffee if possible. That last phrase, if possible, belongs to so much of domestic history. Sometimes the list was not even complete because the shopper expected the street to correct it. The market might decide the meal. The grocer might mention that a shipment had arrived. The butcher might say that the better cut was gone, but there was something cheaper if it was cooked gently. And so the household plan had to remain soft around the edges, ready to bend around weather, stock, price, and whatever had spoiled too soon in someone else's crate. This made shopping feel less like executing a plan and more like negotiating with the day itself. It sits quietly beside ordinary desires. Meat, if possible. Oranges, if possible. Extra milk, if possible. A little sugar, if possible. Something nice for Sunday, if possible. Before supermarkets turned choice into a long aisle, choice was often narrower, more seasonal, and more openly tied to means. You ate what was available, what could be afforded, what could be stored, and what the cook could transform without wasting fuel or time. Season mattered more than it does now. Strawberries had a season. Tomatoes had a season. Fresh peas had a season. Certain fish, certain fruits, certain greens came and went with the year, with weather, with distance, with local habit. This could make food feel more precious. It could also make it boring. There is a lovely romance in eating with the seasons when you are imagining it from a warm bed with a full refrigerator nearby. It is less romantic in the grey part of the year, when the same roots and stored foods keep returning to the table with the steady politeness of guests who will not leave. Old foodways were not automatically better, and they were not automatically worse. They were more bound to place, more bound to weather, more bound to labour, more bound to what could be carried. Carrying matters. Before the cart and the parking lot, the body knew the shopping. A basket cut into the arm. Paper parcels softened in the rain. Eggs had to be protected. Milk was heavy. Potatoes were heavier than seemed reasonable. If a household did not have delivery, or a helpful child, or a horse cart, or later a bicycle or tram route that made things easier, then groceries were measured not only in price, but in weight. The walk home could be its own quiet trial, the basket against a hip, the umbrella awkward under one arm, the butcher's parcel wrapped carefully and still somehow damp, the bread tucked safely away from rain, the coins gone, the list folded, the mind already rearranging dinner. And when the shopper reached home, the work did not end. That is one of the soft traps of grocery shopping in any century. The errand looks complete when the food enters the house. But the food is only potential. It still has to become meals. It has to be put away correctly, remembered, protected from damp, protected from heat, protected from pests, protected from children who believe raisins are a public resource, and protected from the simple passage of time. A paper parcel of meat went to the coolest place available. Bread was wrapped. Tea returned to a tin. Sugar went into a jar. Greens were sorted. Soft fruit was set where it could be seen before it was too late. Milk was kept cool. Leftovers were considered. The pantry door closed, and then the mind opened again. Breakfast tomorrow, supper tonight. Something for the worker carrying lunch, something for the child, something for the sick person upstairs, something that would not use too much fuel, something that would not feel too thin, something that could be served without apology. This is the part of old grocery shopping that can be easy to miss. The shops were visible. The baskets were visible. The market stalls were visible. But the planning was mostly invisible. It happened while sweeping. It happened while washing cups. It happened while lying awake in bed, listening to the house settle and remembering that the grocer's account was due, that the flour was low, that the butcher should be visited early if there was any hope of getting the better scraps. There were also rationing habits that lingered long after official rationing ended in different places. People who had lived through shortages did not always become casual with food just because shelves improved. They saved string. They smoothed paper. They kept jars. They used stale bread. They scraped fat. They stretched tea. They treated leftovers not as a lifestyle choice, but as common sense with a slightly stern face. To waste food was not just expensive, it could feel morally wrong. And that feeling could settle into a household for years. A small heel of bread might become crumbs. A spoonful of vegetables might go into soup. Bones might be boiled until they had given up everything useful. Tea leaves might be used more than once. A jar might be turned upside down, coaxed, scraped, and looked at with the kind of concentration usually reserved for important documents. There is something faintly funny about that, and also tender. The domestic world was full of little acts of resistance against waste, not heroic, not grand. Just someone standing at a table making tomorrow slightly easier by refusing to throw away what could still be persuaded into usefulness. At the same time, old shopping could be more tiring because it required relationships. A supermarket rarely remembers you. It may track you in a modern way, which is its own strange little arrangement, but it does not look up from behind a counter and know that your husband has been out of work, or that your account is late, or that you are buying less tea than usual. The old shopkeeper might know, and maybe that knowledge helped. Maybe he gave credit, maybe he set aside something decent. Maybe he sent a delivery even when the account was not quite settled. But being helped can also feel exposing. Poverty is often hardest when it has to speak politely, so the grocery counter could become a stage for composure. A woman might stand there with gloves worn thin at the fingertips, asking for a smaller amount in a voice that made it sound ordinary. A child might be sent with a note because children could carry embarrassment more lightly, or because adults hoped they could. A shopkeeper might wrap the parcel without comment, which may have been the kindest comment available. There were quiet codes in all of this. The cut of meat, the amount of sugar, the brand of tea, the choice of bread, the request for credit, the habit of paying on payday, the little pause before saying, "Just put it on the account." So much of household life passed through these small phrases, and then, after the errands, the street would continue without ceremony, the market closing, stall holders covering what remained, wilted leaves swept into piles, crates stacked, the grocer counting cash and checking the book, the butcher scrubbing the block, the baker cooling the last loaves. Milk bottles washed somewhere out of sight, ready to begin the cycle again. By late afternoon, the home would hold the day's purchases in its quiet corners. The kitchen might smell faintly of onions, brown paper, bread crust, damp wool, and whatever had been brought in from the street. The basket might sit by the door, emptied but not quite clean, with a little soil caught in the weave. The list might be folded under a tin or left near the stove. The ledger entry existed elsewhere, in the shop, but it also existed in the mind. And dinner still had to be made. This is where the old grocery world becomes less picturesque. It is easy to love the image of the market. The striped awnings, the baskets, the shining apples, the baker's window, the glass milk bottles in morning light. But feeding people was not an illustration. It was repetition. It was deciding again and again how to turn what was available into what was acceptable. It was making a meal from things that did not quite match. It was apologizing without saying sorry. It was hoping the bread stretched, hoping the stew thickened, hoping no one complained too much, hoping the account would be settled before the grocer became less patient. There could be pleasure in it too. The first slice of a fresh loaf, the small luxury of good butter, the smell of coffee grinding, the arrival of oranges in winter, the sweetness of berries eaten while they were still truly seasonal, the satisfaction of a pantry shelf filled after a careful shop, the comfort of a known butcher saving a good piece because he knew what your family liked, the relief of milk already waiting outside the door. Convenience did exist before supermarkets. It was just distributed differently. It lived in relationships, routines, delivery rounds, standing orders, credit, memory, and the small competence of people who knew their trades. The supermarket later gathered many of those functions into one place. It made shopping faster for many households. It made anonymity easier. It made abundance visible. It also changed the texture of food buying, turning a route through human relationships into a quieter passage through shelves. Something was gained. Something was lost. And mostly, as with so much daily history, people adjusted because dinner was not going to wait for a philosophical conclusion. As evening settles over the older street, we can imagine the shops closing one by one. The market square is darker now. The wooden stalls are bare. The last leaves cling to the wet stones. The grocer's window glows for a little while longer, with tins and jars arranged behind glass, and the ledger closed but not forgotten. Somewhere, a delivery boy leans a bicycle against a wall. Somewhere, a milk cart is being prepared for morning. Somewhere, bread dough waits under cloth. And inside one small kitchen, a person stands at a table and empties the last parcel. There is flour on the shelf, there is tea in the tin, there are potatoes in the bin, There is milk cooling as well as it can. There is bread wrapped for tomorrow. There is a little meat perhaps, or bones for broth, or greens that need using before they fade. The day's shopping is finished, but the thinking continues softly. What can be made tonight? What must be saved? What can be stretched? What can be warmed again? What can wait? The household is fed not by abundance alone, but by attention, by someone noticing, someone remembering, someone walking through rain with a basket, someone standing patiently while sugar is weighed, someone accepting credit with a calm face, someone rinsing milk bottles, someone turning stale bread into something that still feels like care, and maybe this is why the old grocery world feels so strange from here. It was slower, and sometimes warmer, and sometimes more humiliating, and often more inconvenient than our bright modern aisles. It made food feel close to the people who sold it, close to the weather that shaped it, close to the money that allowed it, and close to the hands that carried it home. So as we leave that older street tonight, we can let it become quiet again. The awnings are folded. The counters are wiped. The butcher's block is clean. The baker's oven cools in the dark. The grocer's pencil rests beside the closed ledger. The empty basket waits near the door. And in the pantry behind a wooden latch, the small supplies of tomorrow sit in their jars and tins and paper wrappings, not abundant exactly, not effortless, but enough for the night.